my job did go. It's almost like slave labor down in northern Mexico. My job did leave me, baby. My job did leave me. I could die. My job did leave me. I could die. Yes, way down here in Juarez. That's where my job did go. It's almost like slave labor down in northern Mexico. My job did leave me, my job did leave me. My job did leave me. My job did leave me. I could die. My job did leave me.
I'm Mike Cavanaugh. This is another edition of Cavanaugh's Corner, the labor talk show here in southern Maine on public access television. This afternoon I'm joined by a variety of guests to discuss two related issues that affect workers, working families here in Maine as well as around the country. Those issues have to do with the return of sweatshop conditions for many workers and our nation's trade policies and how those issues might be related. And here to join me to discuss those issues, we have Congressman Tom Allen to my left, at least seated to my left for this show. Tom, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. Good to be here.
And Kathy Love. Kathy is seated to Tom's left. Kathy's currently a dislocated worker from SCI in Augusta, a temporarily, we hope, unemployed electrical engineer. And Kathy, welcome to Biddeford. On the far left is Wally Zimmita. Wally is the Unite business agent in the Saco-Biddeford area, known to many in the greater area, lovingly referred to as Wally. Wally, welcome.
Nice to be here, Michael.
And on my right, at least on this show, is John Diefenbacker Crawl, and John is the executive director, I think, of the Maine People's Alliance, a statewide organization that fights for citizens' rights across the state of Maine. So, John, welcome.
Thanks for inviting me today.
Sure. This is a great opportunity, Tom, particularly for us to have a conversation with you. As I'm sure our viewers know, were elected as our congressional representative from this district back in the fall, and we've been discussing both of these issues, you and I and a number of other people, and we very much like the opportunity to discuss these with you today, hear your views on some of these issues. So if I might, without further ado, just to sort of introduce this topic to our viewers, and maybe I'll let you set this up as well, just to talk about the Stop Sweatshop Act. We have a short videotape that we're going to be showing here in a second, but I wonder, Tom, if you might comment before we introduce this videotape about the sweatshop issue as you see it.
Well, one of the things that's true about the garment industry in general is that there are thousands and thousands of shops where different kinds of quality of clothing are produced. And what we've seen both on the West Coast and the East Coast is an increasing number of them are not living up to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And there may be minimum wage violations, there may be overtime violations, there may be child labor violations, but the fact is that in many places around the country, we're finding the recreation of sweatshops. And some of the stories have appeared in the paper, and the Department of Labor has been out after some of them. But the fact is that there is no way for the U.S. Department of Labor to keep track of tens of thousands of shops, often very small ones. And so I am a co-sponsor of the Stop Sweatshops Act of 1997. And that's an act that really tries to make sure that those who manufacture apparel, and maybe contracting out some of the work and getting apparel from a shop and then going on to put the finishing touches on it and then distribute it, that the manufacturers and the retailers in certain circumstances are going to be held responsible for the labor standards of the folks that they're buying from. And frankly, I think this is the only way to get at the fundamental problem.
Right. Well, certainly that's something Unite has been quite active on, as you know, and I think a lot of our viewers know. We've talked on this show many times about the return of sweatshops at home and abroad, because frankly, this is an issue that's driving down wages and living standards for workers in our industries, workers in our shops, workers here in Maine. Unite has produced a short videotape that we'd like to show you right now that sort of describes this issue, talks about some of the things that our union has been doing along with other groups, religious groups and others who support basic human rights for workers. And I think this will be a good opportunity to take a look at the issue and understand why Congressman Allen and some 80 or 90 others already have agreed to co-sponsor this bill. So let's just take a look right now.
All across the country, Unite members are taking on some of the nation's largest retailers and apparel companies, protesting the use of sweatshops to make name brand and store brand clothing sold in many national chains.
The holiday shopping season has been stung by a sweatshop expose.
I want to personally deliver coal to the president of this company. Yeah. Because they need to know that making money by using factories where the people don't get paid is very naughty.
Two retail giants and a labor union are at odds over what's behind some holiday glitter and glitz. Labor says there's a dark side that exploits workers in sweatshops.
They don't go out and check to make sure that these products aren't being made in sweatshops. They're not making sure that the products aren't being made by children of 12 and 13 years old.
We're here to tell the company to take responsibility for the conditions of the workers.
The union says that the workers here, some as young as 14 years old, complained that they were hit and sexually harassed by their bosses.
It is a message to corporate America, to the multinationals, and to the exploiters. If you make it or sell it, we will hold you responsible.
We're sick and tired of the standard of living plummeting, and we're taking a stand to raise the standard of living for good working people around the world, and especially right here.
100 years ago, sweatshops were common in the garment industry. Children worked right along with their parents, at home or in factories, for 10, 12, or even 14 hours a day, and families still barely made enough to survive. Then garment workers organized unions to win better pay and working conditions and to end child labor. These workers and their unions knew that they had to win better conditions for all garment workers. They had to get rid of sweatshops because the existence of sweatshops makes it hard to win improvements and keep good jobs. Today, sweatshops are back. You can find them in Mexico and Central America, in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, in Bangladesh and Indonesia. And you can find them right here in the United States, in New York City, in Los Angeles, in Miami. The U.S. government admits sweatshops in this country are a major problem.
We know that there are 22,000 cutting and sewing shops in the garment industry. We also know that about half, 11,000, are violating the minimum wage and overtime laws, and about a third are seriously threatening the health and safety of their workers.
A Unite expose on the use of sweatshops by the nation's largest department store chain included this interview with a sweatshop worker in New York City.
We work from 7 in the morning to 7 at night. We work on Saturdays and sometimes on Sundays too. We never get paid overtime. At 4 in the afternoon, the owner comes through and punches out our time cards, but we keep working.
California state labor officials continue their crackdown on sweatshops.
They were working 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. About $1 an hour, maybe.
Investigators believe the garments are being made for major U.S. clothing firms.
My boss is screaming to me all the time. He's always very angry. I can't ask him any question because I'm afraid he's going to hit me.
If we have to make a lot of clothes in a few days, we have to work sometimes until 1 or 2 a.m.
You better not go too often to the bathroom because I gonna subtract some money from your salary.
In El Monte, California, government investigators found dozens of immigrants from Thailand, some of whom had been held in captivity for years, forced to work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, for pay amounting to 55 cents an hour. Why is this happening now, when there is more wealth in this country than ever before? With corporate profits skyrocketing, with politicians telling us the economy is great, why are there more and more sweatshops in the United States?
With the emergence of a global economy, the big corporations are rewriting the rules for their own benefit. One result is sweatshops, at home and abroad. With NAFTA and GATT, they gave themselves a green light to search the globe for the cheapest labor costs. Then they come back here and expect working people to compete. They say, if we won't work for less, if we won't give up the standard of living that we fought so hard for, we can say goodbye to our jobs. They're putting a gun to our heads, trying to force us to compete in their race to the bottom.
The retailers doesn't want to pay the money. They can find other places to do it, and sweatshops.
We're losing our jobs because they're treating these workers like dogs. And this is just not right to these workers, and it's not fair to our workers. And we have to put pressure on these stores and not let them buy from these sweatshops.
This sweatshop system is hurting all of us, not just garment workers. In most manufacturing industries, a few big companies call the shots. If we don't accept what they offer, they tell us they can find workers who will. Even where jobs can't be moved overseas, like jobs in laundries and distribution centers, companies are downsizing, speeding up, contracting out, and using low-paid temporary and part-time workers to eliminate good jobs. All workers are suffering. Big business is doing fine. Since 1979, corporate profits have increased 37%. But during those same years, our real wages, the buying power of our paychecks, have gone down 13%. It's clear who is benefiting and who is paying the price.
I'm an auto parts worker, and sweatshops do affect us. They affect us by driving our standard of living down. And when we go to the negotiating table, there's always the threat of that we can do it cheaper somewhere else.
We're all going to be in trouble because the sweatshops are going to be moving more and more into America, even more so than they are now. And then that's going to lower our standards and our wages and our benefits and our job protection.
Sweatshops not only overseas, but it can be here in the United States. And even in my distribution center, we're running into problems where we find our work's being contracted out for people who don't get no benefits at all, and now it's affecting us. We got to do something to try to make sure that we protect our rights and our jobs for our future.
This march and this rally is more than about sweatshops in the garment district of New York. That's because every workplace in America is being turned into a sweatshop. We march today because America needs a raise.
Unite is in the forefront of the fight against sweatshops. We're organizing more people into our union. With a union, workers have a way to fight back against sweatshops and a falling standard of living. And we're supporting workers in other countries who are organizing their own unions so they can stand up to international corporations. We're taking direct action to confront the corporations that profit from sweatshops. They'll keep using sweatshops until we force them to stop. Our leafleting and publicity forced the Gap to agree to independent monitors in its foreign plants. We're shaping public opinion. We say it's not okay to make money from sweatshop labor, and people agree. Public opinion puts pressure on the companies and the politicians, making them take action. When conditions in Kathy Lee's factories were exposed, public opinion forced her to improve conditions and take a stand against sweatshops. We're working for new laws on the national, state, and local levels. The law should make retailers financially responsible for sweatshop violations. The law should prohibit spending tax money in sweatshops. A city in Ohio passed a law prohibiting the sale of sweatshop-made goods. We're working to make the politicians do the right thing for working people. No Unite member can afford to sit back and let the corporations push us down to the bottom. Stand up and join us. The fight against sweatshops is a fight for better jobs and a living wage for all of us.
We're back here in the studios at the Unite office in Biddeford. Mike Cavanaugh with John Diefenbacker Crawl, Congressman Tom Allen, Kathy Love, and Wally Zimmita. And we're here to talk about the issue that you just saw described on the video, sweatshops, but really talking about what's happening in terms of our nation's trade policies and how they might be either improving or contributing to the sweatshop condition. And I guess maybe we haven't really sort of rehearsed how we're going to proceed with this, but Tom, let me ask you just to make a comment about you're sponsoring this bill, as you said, for those of viewers who may have tuned in late. Congressman Allen is co-sponsoring a bill, the Stop Sweatshops Act of 1997. And just sort of, Tom, your reaction, and then I'd like to see if we can talk with our other guests about their contribution to this as well.
Well, that video is a very good example of why legislation is needed. There are, as Secretary Rice said, there are about 22,000 cutting and sewing shops around in this country, and he estimated that 11,000 of them are violating the law with respect to minimum wage or overtime requirements. And the problem is the federal government can't get at 22,000 different cutting and sewing shops individually. I mean, there's no way. The Labor Department is smaller than it used to be, but even at its peak, it wouldn't be possible. So what's important is to make sure that down the chain, that the manufacturers of the clothing and that the retailers of the clothing bear some responsibility for what they're buying. And that's why this act is an attempt to give the Department of Labor more responsibility, an attempt to try to eliminate sweatshops here in this country. Dealing with the issue around the world is another whole issue, and I know we're going to get into that, but it's a very important part of what we need to do in this Congress.
Right. Well, I think maybe let's use that opportunity to kind of segue to how this relates to what happens around the world, because certainly is the point the video made, and I think, certainly I know Tom would agree, that it's all connected. We're not, the United States is not operating as an economy irrespective of what goes on in the rest of the world. And this is not an issue that only affects people in the clothing and textile industry. John, let me turn to you for starters, just in terms of your view of the issue of trade and our nation's trade policies, NAFTA being probably the most prominent example of trade policy. What do you think in terms of the contribution either to or against the sweatshop conditions that we've been talking about?
Well, I think NAFTA is going to exacerbate the type of thing that we saw in this video. I think it already is. I think what it does is it sets in motion something that's very unfortunate. International trade is often held up as an end in of itself, and this automatic assumption that it's going to bring prosperity and benefits to all. What we're seeing, though, too often as international trade is rewarding some of those corporations that we saw in those headlines from the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and certain CEOs, but a lot of average people, NAFTA, international trade are having devastating impacts. And too often, I believe that we're being pushed into a race to the bottom, where we're looking to compete against others for, pennies on the dollar an hour, for no or little benefits. And what we really need to do is set floors so that we're competing on a level where people are going to have benefits, are going to have job security, are going to earn wages. If people work 40 hours a week, they should be living a wage that's going to support their family in some sort of decent sort of standard of living relative to that country.
Let me ask Kathy Love now, and probably the proper way to do this is to introduce you a little bit, Kathy. We should say, just for disclosure, that Kathy is not a member of our union. She's not a member of anybody's union at the moment. Kathy and I
would love you to join.
That's right. We'll deal with that later. But I had a chance to meet Kathy about 2 hours before we went on the air, and learned a little bit about the fact that Kathy worked for a number of years, worked as a student at the University of Maine, Orono, to get your degree in electrical engineering.
Right.
And
I
then
graduated from Orono in '93, and I went to work for Digital Equipment in Augusta, and Digital was bought by SCI a year later. And then in January, I was laid off from my job. Downsizing was the reason. And I am currently unemployed. I have not been able to find work in my field in central Maine. I live in Pittsfield.
Now, Kathy, you're maybe a little bit different than what a lot of people, I think, probably think that the NAFTA issue and trade issues are something that, well, certainly they affect clothing workers and textile workers. but the high-tech, high-skilled jobs of the future, electrical engineering and so on, are the sort of jobs that, well, maybe people don't often think those are the jobs as well that are lost. You talk a little bit about what it's been like for you and other people you know. You mentioned to me at lunch about others that you know who were also engineers and other higher skilled workers.
The people that I know that have been laid off from SCI at this point, no one, I know of no other engineers who have been able to find work in Maine. People have moved, people have found other things to do, people are still unemployed.
That's an issue that, you know, we've talked about here, the fact that the trade agreements, if they're not established in a way that's going to be designed to raise standards, are going to lead to the lessing of standards. And SCI, as a case in point, is a company here in central Maine that does have extensive and growing operations in Mexico. And I know that, Kathy, you were describing, and others who attended the meeting with the Department of Labor explained how when you were laid off, the Department of Labor suggested you could apply for trade adjustments under the NAFTA Act,
Right.
but you'd be
Better
foolish to
off
do so.
under TAA was the recommendation.
Because
Because the benefits would be better. And I have actually at this point applied for benefits under TAA. I'm accepted at school, change in career, and for an associate degree, and have put in for tuition assistance under TAA, and I'm waiting for approval.
I don't know whether, you know, during the NAFTA debate a few years ago, I'm sure everybody will recall that there was this suggestion that, well, even though NAFTA might cost some jobs, we'd establish this NAFTA adjustment assistance. And one of the things that's puzzled me as to why it seems that there's so few people who've taken advantage of it. And as we talk about it in Kathy's case and look into it a little bit more, it turns out that that act is less advantageous to a dislocated worker than trade adjustment assistance, which in and of itself is probably not.
And my experience is that the Trade Act assistance will give me tuition reimbursement, but I haven't figured out how I pay my living expenses while I am going back to school.
Well, we've seen that certainly with textile workers, and we're hearing about it with electrical engineering. And I think we would like to explore a little bit further as we have after we have a chance to hear from everybody what the implications might be for future trade arrangements. Wally, let me ask you to comment for a bit, because you represented textile workers in this area for a long time. Used to be a lot more than there are now, and you're somebody probably you're known as a guy with your own opinions. What's your opinion about this trade issue, Wally?
The trade issue, I mean, looking at the situation, you know, they tell you how it's supposed to bring up the standards of living going around. You take, like, if it went down into Mexico. Now, the Mexicans were supposed to be able to buy our products. Well, they manufacture these refrigerators. Now, if they could afford to buy the refrigerator, where would they afford the electricity to plug the refrigerator in? They don't even have electricity. I mean, you take a look at the conditions they live in. And the NAFTA was supposed to basically help things. What has it done? It's brought down the environment. It's brought down the standard of living, and it's brought sweatshops here in the United States. That's what it's actually brought into. So, you know, we say, what are we going to do? Now they want to expand this NAFTA type situation. I think what we have to do is we've got to work and put standards into this thing to control the NAFTA that we recently have right now.
Well, that's very good, because that's exactly what, you know, Tom, you and I have talked about, and I know you've thought about a good deal about, and have recently, you know, correspondence with about.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you might be able to talk with our viewers a bit about what you and the Congress are going to be facing soon about this NAFTA expansion, and your thoughts about it.
Well, there are a number of trade issues we're going to be dealing with this year, and it's a challenge to sort through them all. I do think that we're into a new phase in our sort of foreign trade policy, and that's why I've co-sponsored an act that's sponsored by Bernie Sanders and David Bonnier and some others, called the Fast Track Accountability and Fairness Act. And what that's trying to do is say, if we're going to have free trade, labor standards and environmental standards need to be part of the subject matter of the trade. You know, we need to negotiate over labor standards and environmental standards. Otherwise, what happens, or what's likely to happen, is that we'll be back to a pure form of capitalism internationally, where labor standards are actually suppressed and environmental standards are degraded around the world. That's not what we want. I mean, it took free trade, I think, is important. A freer trading environment is important, but not at any price, and not for its own sake. And it seems to me that we have to replicate globally what's happened in all of the industrialized world over the last 60 years. I mean, in the last 60 years in this country, certain labor standards were put in place. There's been an environmental movement to lift environmental standards, and that has greatly benefited people who live and work in this society. We can't, I think, get into a situation where all of that gets lost in the global environment, because we want essentially as close to a level playing field as we can get. And it's not going to be completely level because conditions are so different in other countries. I mean, we're not going to, we can't ask all countries to be developed at the same time in the same way. But I do think that it is time to focus not on trade for its own sake, and but simply to get back to having some standards that will say, at a minimum, other countries need to abide by internationally recognized labor standards and some sort of international environmental standards, so that we're lifting all people together and not pushing down on the workers in this country and around the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's, John, you were talking about some of those issues earlier as far as the standards and having some sort of standards and sort of the direction in which we're going. I mean, you're familiar a little bit with the kinds of legislation that the congressman and others are going to be facing down there. What do you think about the direction this is going?
Though there are some good people who we admire for trying to stand up and protect workers and the environment on the legislation that you're co-sponsoring, at Maine People's Alliance, we're really favoring a tougher provision called the NAFTA Accountability Act, which we've met with you, Congressman Allen, Mike, and other folks talking about that. We see the experience from NAFTA. I'm glad that you agree that having these things as side agreements just don't cut it. And in fact, there are 3 pending actions. One, an important environmental case involving some issues in Canada that are very important, that are troublesome to an organization like Maine People's Alliance's work on environmental and consumer issues. I think also something I'm really concerned about with fast track authority, that forces you as a congressperson to essentially suspend a lot of the things you normally do as a congressional representative in talking to committee chair people, of getting input and debating the issue. You have to accept the agreement up or down. And my experience in the Maine legislature and dealing with the United States Congress, it's hard to think that an agreement, even after, or a bill coming out of committee, or an agreement negotiated by our president and our trade representatives is perfect, and that the only thing we can do is bless it up or down. It's really a suspension of democratic rights. I think it's something we really need to stay away from. If the agreement is so good, why not let it go under the normal rules of Congress? If it can stand up to the light of day, if it's that good an agreement, it will get the support that it needs to be enacted. But don't suspend the democratic process. I think that's a code, that's a tip-off, that there must be something wrong with this legislation, that we've got to try to ram it through with fast-track authority, suspending the normal rules of debate.
You know, I don't think anybody, not anybody, but maybe you should explain a little bit what we're talking about here, fast track.
Because I think I disagree with that. What fast track is it means that it is a delegation of authority to the president to negotiate with another country a trade agreement. And you can argue whether we ought to have any agreements or not, but the point is this: unless you delegate it to the president, and there is a vote up or down at the end of at some point, then the Congress, then the administration really can't negotiate with another country effectively, because the other side will never know what the final deal would be, because they'd have to come back to Congress and go through the whole process again. And essentially, the negotiating would be carried over into the congressional chamber itself. And it's not really a matter of whether this is such a good deal or not. It's that opinions are varied. Believe me, 435 members of the House of Representatives, they have very different issues, very different opinions, not just on trade issues generally, but they will be driven very much by the impact on their particular district. So I think that if you don't have fast track at all, you're really saying don't negotiate trade agreements, because I don't see how it would be easy to do that. What's important to me is to say, if you're going to negotiate trade agreements, we are not going to have labor standards and environmental standards pushed aside, left for someone else to do, and put with side agreements that can't effectively be enforced. We need to make them part of the negotiating process itself. And I think if that happens, of course that runs straight into issues of national sovereignty, and other states will say you can't tell us how to run our own countries. But what we have to do, when we negotiate a trade agreement, there are certain values that we are fighting for, and values that are important to this democracy, that are important to this society. And I think those values need to be front and center, not sort of left off to the side. The trend toward globalization is continuing, and it will continue whether or not any other trade negotiation ever occurs. I mean, right now in this world, capital moves, it moves fast, it moves to other countries. And I think we need to conduct our trade negotiations so that we're lifting standards, labor standards and environmental standards here and around the world, and not suppressing them. And I'm just trying to be as practical as I can in terms of what makes sense. We don't disagree on the goals, but I have less confidence that any sort of agreement could ever be negotiated with the Congress as a whole.
Well, I'd make one comment here, and that is that oftentimes those of us in labor have been, they try to pigeonhole us and characterize us as against trade, or protectionist is a word that's supposedly a bad word. Now, I don't think that necessarily protecting, your family, protecting your community is a bad thing, but nonetheless, we're often characterized as being sort of Neanderthals and our head in the sand and all this stuff about international trade issues. I think many people probably maybe agree now that we've got a little bit broader horizon about things. And we've said that trade for the purpose of raising standards may be a good thing. And it was interesting when I first called Kathy to ask her if she would come down and join us for this conversation. She said, I don't really know that much about NAFTA. I'm not sure how I feel about NAFTA exactly, but if it's an agreement that is raising standards for people, that's probably a good thing, right? And I wonder if you could kind of just, not coming from a political point of view exactly about this, but what you're feeling about the whole issue of trade agreements and how they've impacted us.
My first reaction was that I felt very much that trade as a whole is a good thing, and I didn't want to go back to, I don't foresee going back to a time when we can be an isolationist and not wanting to see that, but yet feeling very strongly that the gains that have been made in this country to raise labor standards, improve working conditions, health and safety issues, environmental issues are very important to keep those. And people, knowing engineers who have professionals who have gone to other countries and seen working conditions there, and bringing back to me some very sad stories about what working conditions are like there.
Well, that's right. I mean, you look at what's happened along the border with Mexico, the maquiladora industries, those very low wage manufacturing plants, aren't going away. They're growing, and it's a real problem to have those kinds of facilities outside. I've talked to people from who have related, they work for businesses that are located overseas, and they will say that their particular company tries to maintain high standards, but it's even if that's true for some companies, it sure isn't true for everyone.
And it may not be true for the companies that they buy products from.
Right.
If they buy cable assemblies, their suppliers, those companies' working conditions may not be good.
Wally, you were here in 1993 when we had we had all this debate at the time about NAFTA, and there were those who represented that NAFTA would be this wonderful, great, boon for our economy, and everybody, all would rise, all boats would raise. There were others who thought it would be the end of Western civilization as we know it, and there were grand statements made all sorts of ways. But I wonder if you could, just reflect on what do you think that, what sort of bill of goods do you think, frankly, we were sold about what NAFTA was going to accomplish for us?
NAFTA, you know, the bill of goods that the workers that I represent, you know, and they still feel this way today, that they were sold that this NAFTA was going to be a good thing, it was going to create jobs for them, and they were going to have work, going to have this different thing. Naturally, they're going to have the free trade, but they were going to build up these standards in the other countries and then to allow them to bring in money. The thing is, what's happening is with this country, people are being told, if you don't work faster, you don't work harder, you don't work for less money, we're going to move to Mexico. I have, like we got one plant, okay, Dutchess Farm Industries is owned by Chamberlain, okay, they make garage door openers. They were made here in the United States, out in California. They moved to Tijuana. Why? Cheaper labor. Come out and said it was cheaper labor. He had a dispute, okay, with the workforce. They're non-unionized, but he had a dispute. He moved into Mexico. And this was happening. You know, we talk about fast track. The president should want to negotiate, let him negotiate. But he ought to have standards that he has to abide by. You must do this, you must do this. Now the other portion I look at, we see is, here you got a company. Well, I'm not making enough money, so I'm going to move it to Mexico. You want to move it to Mexico? Fine. But you will pay the same price as you're in Mexico when you ship your goods back in the United States. You want to move to Mexico, move to Mexico. Well, you're not going to get free trade. This is something I think that ought to be placed. And this is what some of the workers were saying. Here in the United States, we're saying, they want my job, but if they have to pay to bring it back here, they won't send it there. They'll stay here.
Right. I think the way to evaluate, and the Congressman is right, there are many issues that are going to come forward as far as what we do about trade, and there'll be, you know, if not now in the month, this is being filmed in late May, and there's some discussion that maybe in the month of June, this fast track issue might come up. Sounds to me now like maybe it's going to be pushed off a little bit further.
I would bet September or October.
Yeah, stay tuned, folks. We may there may be a rerun of the show come the fall, but nonetheless there'll be a lot of debate about what have the effects of NAFTA been, and you know, has NAFTA been a good thing or a bad thing, and depends on, you know, where you sit, and I don't know what the statistics are about the state of Maine, and you know, this sort of anecdotally we know these things, but I wonder if, I mean, you know, we know Kathy's situation, we know about her company, and we know about moving of jobs to Mexico there, and we know about places where the sort of the threat is made, but I wonder what maybe is, John, you were sort of on a statewide basis, what your reflection might be about NAFTA's impacts in Maine, and also to Tom, and what either or both of you have heard on a statewide basis.
One thing I guess I want to answer that sort of a sideways, Mike.
Go ahead.
Is one thing, we have a lot of agreement at the table, and I'm glad to hear the Congressman, we're all agreed, Wally and Kathy and you and I, about the need to raise standards in these agreements. That we agree with. But something I think the position of an elected official has a tremendous ability to educate the public. And I don't know if we do a disservice to the public when we say it's inevitable that we're going to have this international trade, because essentially the economy in the state of Maine, the United States, in the world is a human creation. I mean, it's inevitable that we have tides and we revolve around the sun, but this is something that we create. And if our economy in the state of Maine in the United States is not serving us well, that's something that we really need to examine. And I would say the root cause of a lot of these economic dislocations, of leaving someone like Kathy, a person who worked hard and got her degree, did all the things that the American dream says excels, worked her butt off, got her degree in a profession where there aren't a lot of women with those kinds of degrees, and then is left high and dry a few years. We really need to examine our corporations. What are they doing? I think there has to be a lot more corporate accountability. We've got a lot of political discourse right now about accountability with welfare recipients, but I think we need to really shift and have a lot more corporate accountability and examine, is this the kind of economy that we really want to have, doing this to folks? And I think we can do things, because we give those corporate charters. The ability to do business as a Maine corporation or in the United States is something that the people of the United States grant. And we should really examine, are the corporations using the privileges of having, you know, immunity from liability, of being able to pool large sums of capital? We should really be looking at, are they using that power well to serve the people and their own interests? I have no problem with them making profits, but is this lifting everyone up, or are we having and increasing a small elite that is benefiting while others are being left behind?
I want to react. I mean, I agree with much of what you're saying about the need for more accountability, more corporate accountability. Trade is the tough issue because there are winners and losers. I mean, there's no question that some companies and their employees gain by expansion of trade. I mean, the fact is that, you know, we have 5% of the world's population. 95% is out there. And my understanding, don't hold me to this exact number, but I think about 30% of our gross domestic product is related to trade. And so trade is, you know, important to the health of this economy. And when I said I think that the globalization trends will continue, I think they are. I think that it's not just what this country does, it's what's happening around the world. And whether it's the Western Hemisphere, Latin America and South America, whether it's Europe, Eastern Europe, or Southeast Asia, there is much more rapid movement of capital across national boundaries. I think that is likely to continue, frankly. And the question in my mind is, how do we make sure that we take advantage of trends for the benefit of working people here and around the world? I mean, you know, if John, if you and I were king together, you know, we might shape a different world. But there are so many players, there's so many different countries, and there are these movements that sweep through countries at different times. And right now, this movement, the increasing technological development and globalization are the two forces that are expanding, you know, around the globe. And I frankly, I want to make sure that those forces are good. The question is not, you know, the question is, what is the goal of free trade? What's it for? Who's it going to benefit? I think those questions you raise are exactly the right ones.
Wally?
Yeah. You know, you mentioned about it, that this has basically benefited us. Can you give me an example? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'd like to give us an example where it has benefited the workers here in the United States.
Oh, yeah, you would be putting me on the spot if you did that, but you can get, and we can give you all sorts of studies that will show you which industries have grown and are, you know, very reliant on exports. I mean, for example, take one example, Boeing. They make planes around the world. Washington, the state of Washington is 2% of the country's people, 9% of its trade. You know, exporting for them is critically important. They want to be able to get into the Chinese market. They want to be able to get into other markets around the world, and those are good, high-paying jobs. The problem is, this isn't fair. You know, there are some winners and there are some losers. And it's, what we've got to do is make sure that there aren't so many losers. And that
but see, Boeing has basically reduced its workforce. So it's increasing its workforce. So how is the working people here in the United States benefit by this free trade?
All I'm saying is, if they couldn't sell planes overseas, if the trade barriers were such that prevented Boeing from selling overseas, they'd have a lot fewer workers than they do now, because the export is such a big part of their business.
See, I think the question is in whose interest, and you said this about trade. I think this is true about the economy. It's true. It ought to be true about our economic development strategy in Maine and around the country. In whose interest? What are we doing this for? What's the point of all this, right? And I guess, you know, maybe I would step out on a little bit to say that labor might think that the point of the economy is to raise standards of living for workers, not so that people have more things, but maybe you know, more quality to their lives and better, healthier, stronger communities. And you know, the economy ought to be organized around those principles, and trade agreements really ought to be negotiated for the benefit of the people, you know, working people here and in the other countries. Now, I have a prop that I just found. I've had this for some time, and I want to pull this out at this point to show you. Many of you have not yet seen NAFTA, but Kathy, if you would do me this favor, that tome back there, this is stuck. It's so heavy they're having trouble lifting. This is it, folks. This is NAFTA. Actually, this is part one. The second part is in the other room. I couldn't carry them all out. But this is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which I know all members of Congress have read, of course, and so they know whether this is good or bad. But the point of it is that this is full of many pages and many pounds of pages of protections for business, essentially, protection for capital, and how capital will be treated in international trade agreements. And Tom mentioned earlier labor and environmental agreements that are side agreements. You can go through all this whole thing and you're not going to find labor and environmental agreements or requirements. They are little pieces of paper about this size, and they're in a side drawer someplace. And that's really what we're after here is how can we, and Tom, in your position, how can you assure that people are going to be held accountable for what happens in trade agreements in the interests of workers and communities? And I wonder if you could sort of address that. How do we accomplish it?
Well, I think part of the problem, of course, Mike, is that trade agreements are part of the economy, but not the whole of the economy. And especially since the tariffs in other countries are generally higher than tariffs here at home. In some ways, at least mathematically, you might say, well, we've gained more if tariffs are lower generally. And that's been the argument that some NAFTA proponents have used. Trade agreements get oversold, in my opinion, and NAFTA was oversold, no question about it. All sorts of good things will happen, and they didn't. But the difficulty is separating, when you find the maquiladora industries are growing instead of declining, how much of that was related to NAFTA, how much of it was related to the devaluation of the peso. How is the devaluation of the peso connected to NAFTA? I mean, there are all these issues out there. I think what we have to be fighting for is to raise labor and environmental standards. If we have commercial agreements that are purely commercial, that basically protect intellectual property and protect capital when it's invested in another country and do nothing else, we are shortchanging the people in this country, and we're shortchanging people in other countries. Because if free trade is going to have the effect, and leave aside Boeing for the moment, but if free trade is going to have the effect of driving down wages and benefits in this country and driving down wages and benefits in other countries, it's not a good deal, and it shouldn't happen. It's got to do the reverse. It's got to raise them. And that's why I think that in the future, as we negotiate trade agreements, what we ought to be doing is trying to pull other countries up to our labor standards so that unions have the right to organize, so that workers have health and safety protections that we have in this country now, so that they are more likely to be paid a living wage. That needs to be part of these agreements. Some incentive to other countries. The message is, we're going to open our markets to you, we want to make sure that in your country workers are protected, the environment is protected, because that's the only way to lift this whole world at once. And if we don't do it in trade agreements, I don't know how we do it. Frankly, we're not going to have, apart from putting labor standards and environmental standards in our trade agreements, we're going to not have as much of an effect around the globe as we would like.
Well, reaction to that? I mean, the Congressman has set out at least, how he thinks we ought to go about accomplishing this, and anybody's reaction? Kathy, Wally, John?
To me, in the long run, it seems that American workers will be better off if workers all over the world are better off.
You say it so much more succinctly than I just did.
Really? John? I know you can't say it quite that succinctly, but
I better work on my message. I just think, Tom's right, this movement of capital is very troublesome. I do think there are mechanisms where we can control the movement of capital, and looking at if companies have benefited with certain tax breaks and subsidies, some of the things I think Wally was sort of alluding to, having some accountability. If we've helped people build new plants or expand here in Maine with certain representations about jobs, they cash in on the tax breaks or other assistance from the government and then leave, we should at least get our money back.
I agree with you completely. There ought to be, that will tend to be more of a matter of state law than of federal law, at least the way we're set up right now. But it seems to me that we need a movement in this country that provides that if there's going to be substantial public assistance and certain job losses occur or job gains don't occur, that there's some consequence to that. My understanding is that the Bath Iron Works proposal is structured in that way. that if employment falls below a level of 3,500, then, a lot of the economic benefits from the state go away. And it's that kind of proposal that ought to be true. When AT&T did a downsizing of 40,000 people across the country, New Jersey alone lost 7,000 jobs. And it had only been a few years before when New Jersey had given AT&T all sorts of financial and other incentives to locate its corporate headquarters in New Jersey. So the New Jersey taxpayers were left holding the bag. And so not to mention the 7,000 unemployed, the New Jersey taxpayers were left holding a bag. And that's the kind of thing, I agree completely, we need to work on.
Those sort of things are pretty dramatic. People know, certainly the AT&T story. People in Maine certainly are hearing the BIW story. But I'd go so far as to say that that's pretty much the deal that was represented to us with NAFTA. That there would be, the public would agree to, through its lawmaking body, would agree to a system of trade preferences for Mexico and relationships, and the net result has been, the loss, depending on which statistics you look at, 300,000, 400,000 or more, manufacturing jobs, net loss to this country, and that the promises that were made, have not been lived up to. Now, you've said that you're not sponsoring the NAFTA Accountability Act. You might want to talk about that just for a minute. I recognize that given a Republican-controlled Congress, that's probably never going to get to a vote anyway. But you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I'd be glad to. The NAFTA Accountability Act is filed by Marcy Kaptur, and I know that many in labor feel that act would be a good thing. It essentially, I'll tell you, my perspective is, we need to move forward. We need to look ahead and not try to unravel NAFTA. I don't think that this Congress, whether it's a Democrat, whether it's Republican-controlled as it is now, or a Democratic-controlled Congress, is going to unravel a treaty that we have entered into. I just don't think that's likely at all. And I think we spend our energy more efficiently by moving forward and trying to get, and it'd be hard enough to get labor and environmental standards in any fast-track authorization going forward. So that's one reason why I'm not co-sponsoring Marcy Kaptur's bill. The second reason is this, and I mentioned it before. NAFTA was oversold. I mean, I'll agree with everyone. It was oversold. Crime was going to go down. The drug problem was going to be reduced. Employment was going to go up. You name it, and the promises were made. Some of those, it's obvious now, 3 years later, that already some of those things have not come true. But it's not quite as clear that if the drug traffic goes up, that was caused by NAFTA. And it's very hard to separate what economic consequences have flowed from NAFTA and what economic consequences have flowed from the devaluation of the peso and the mismanagement of the Mexican economy. And I have felt that the Kaptur bill basically attributes all bad things to NAFTA in a way that I'm not persuaded that's either accurate as a matter of causation, or two, the place that we really ought to spend our energy.
Well, I guess, people have talked about this using a number of analogies, and one was, as they talk about expanding NAFTA, should we extend it, and should we expand it? We might agree that if we used an analogy that this is like a house, and we're building a house, and we build a house, and the kitchen is on fire right now. Whether the fire was all caused by NAFTA, or partially caused by NAFTA, and partially caused by other things, nonetheless, we pretty much would agree that the kitchen's on fire. I think our position is maybe this is not the time we ought to be building an extension on the house. Maybe we ought to take care of the fire before we build an extension. Now, I don't want to carry the analogy too far, but the point is that looking forward, the question is, do we expand? Do we build on using the same model, using the same building products that we built that kitchen with? And I think our view would be, gee, the NAFTA model, we've tried the NAFTA model with labor and environmental agreements on the side, and basically, business gets what it wants to get. That model's been tried. We're not going to use that one again.
And I think it's time for a new model. That's why I'm not in favor of expanding the NAFTA without labor and environmental standards as part of the agreement 2 other Caribbean basin countries. I have the same reservations about Chile, though I'm not 100% committed on Chile yet. I've co-sponsored a bill that Dick Gephardt is sponsoring that would require congressional approval before China gets into the World Trade Organization. I've not decided yet the issue of MFN status for China, but I have decided that before China gets permanent trading advantages as a member of the WTO, that ought to come before this Congress, and the people of this United States, through the Congress, ought to have a say in whether or not that happens. So that's kind of, I've tried to sort through these different trade issues, keeping in mind that trade overall is a good thing for many people in this country and for many people in other countries, but if it's just trade for the sake of trade, trade for the commerce for the sake of commerce, then we risk losing a lot of employee and labor protections, a lot of environmental protections that people in this country have worked for 60 years to get.
Well, unfortunately, we risk running out of time, which we're just about to right now for our show. I want to thank you, Congressman Allen, and Kathy Love, Wally Zimmita, John Diefenbacker Crawl, and all of our many viewers who've tuned in loyally again to another edition of Cavanaugh's Corner. We've been discussing the extension of trade issues, and I suspect we'll have more to talk about as this bill comes forward. Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay. And please do tune in again to another educational and inspirational edition of Cavanaugh's Corner. And thanks to everybody.
And the crazy thing about this is that they say, well, the answer to this, we're getting buffeted by all of this foreign competition. The answer is more free trade. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the way they tried to treat sick people before they discovered the germ theory. You know what it was? If you got sick, the doctor would come in with a leech to bleed you. So you got sick, and they would take some blood out of you. That was their theory. Yeah. And then you kept getting sick, and the doctor would come back 3 days later and take some more blood. You kept getting sicker, right? I mean, when they take your blood, so you come back and take more blood, and pretty soon you died. If you were lucky, the doctor got sick before you did. Yeah. Well, it's the same kind of syndrome that since we have been in this global economy, living standards have gone down, opportunities have gone down. The opportunities for high school graduates in the United States have practically disappeared. In 12 years, the income of the average high school graduate with up to 5 years work experience has declined 27%.